Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Futures Frame TV Inequalities channel. I'm Alice Krozer, your host for Traces.Dreams. Today I'm here with Dr. Michal Kosinski, who's a professor at Stanford Graduate Business School. He's a professor of psychology. He has studied for many years computer science, psychology, psychometrics, several other related things. He's an expert on all things data, and we're happy to say hello and welcome Michal to our podcast today. How are you, Michal?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing very, very well. A bit bored with my living room, but I guess that's the least of the problems that one can have these days.
It looks very pretty from the outside. Dr. Kosinski, you've been on most important media outlets in the world, speaking in parliaments, in all kinds of important settings. How does it make you feel to be on this podcast finally?
Well, finally, I reached my goal to get onto your podcast. So I'm really grateful that after years of trying, I got a slot.
Thank you kindly. We've started a couple of weeks ago, but thanks for being here with us. Michal, you worked on a thing called digital footprint a couple of years ago, and you developed a way of figuring out how you can check personality by following a digital footprint. Could you say something about what the digital footprint is and how you came up with that connection?
Well, first of all, I don't think that I figured it out. So marketing industry has figured it out, and they have been for many years essentially translating people's behavior, be it when browsing the websites on the internet or using their phones or being on social media and communicating with others, and turning this behavior into very accurate predictions of their intimate psychological traits. And some of those predictions are maybe not that intrusive. For example, social network trying to predict what gender you have or you associate yourself with, and then trying to use this knowledge to optimize the content that is being shown to you. But of course, you can imagine the same techniques being used in more disturbing ways, like, let's say, political marketing organizations trying to figure out your personality, intelligence, and other intimate psychological traits in order to target you with advertising that is going to be most likely to make you, let's say, stay at home and not go to vote. And marketing companies have been doing it for a very long time. And at a certain point, when I got familiar with those methods, I realized that we don't really know how accurate those methods are. People who run those algorithms, such as Facebook, Google, and other big and small marketing companies, do not really want the general public, policymakers, scholars to know how accurate those predictions are. So I decided to essentially, in the context of my psychological lab, try to recreate some of those approaches, try to get some volunteers to share the data with me and see how accurately my algorithms that are trained on, my laptop, can predict their personality. And what we found is that those predictions were extremely accurate. And of course, training those models on a few thousand volunteers using my laptop doesn't give you the same accuracy as can be achieved by companies having access to data of billions of people and having, all of the supercomputing power in the world. So what we found is that those predictions are extremely accurate, which was a bit worrying. And I think the world, when we did this, I think it was 2013, took notice. And hopefully some of the damage that later ensued was limited by the fact that governments and companies were kind of aware of this happening.
What do you think could be an impact of these kind of manipulative strategies, whether consciously or unconsciously manipulating, in terms of inequalities that could ensue, political inequalities maybe, or even economic inequalities?
So I must say that I spend most of my time studying the risks that those technologies present, but I should probably start by saying that great majority of applications is just extremely positive in making our lives, and especially the lives of people who were underprivileged or underprivileged, much easier. So first of all, one has to remember that one person, the same technique that can be used to manipulate you into smoking or drinking alcohol or maybe voting for a candidate that is not really having your best interest in mind, the same algorithm can be used to manipulate you into studying a bit more or maybe eating a bit healthier or getting more interested in educating yourself or getting more connected with your family and friends and so on. And I even, did this air quotes here on manipulation, because essentially one person's manipulation might be another person's education. And
nudge, you call it, right?
Or a nudge, exactly. I think that nudging people to eat healthier, stay connected with their families, be happier is just good. The problem is, of course, that the same techniques can be used to our detriment. Again, I think that as with any other complicated, complex phenomenon, there are always some advantages and disadvantages. So let's say take internet and all of the predictive algorithms that live on the internet and affect our interactions with websites, marketing, and so on. On one hand, of course, companies such as Facebook, Google, and a bunch of other internet giants are great illustrations of the fact that today, very small group of educated, privileged individuals can build tools that will allow them to create enormous value, essentially harvesting a great amount of money, concentrating this great amount of money in the hands of one person or a few thousand people. So this is just kind of the dark side of the internet revolution. But the good side of the internet revolution is that suddenly nearly everyone in the world that has access to the mobile phone, which increasingly even people in very heavily underprivileged environments and backgrounds can have exactly the same access to education, information, communication channels that was reserved to the most privileged people only a few decades before. And of course, one can still say, well, but if you have a lot of time and you're not a single mother and you are very well educated and you live in Palo Alto like I do, you have much more time to, benefit from those modern communication channels and channels to gain information. And when you are working hard and living somewhere where there's no constant access to electricity and you're just overworked and so on, you benefit from those new tools, new technologies less. But the bottom line is still that at least you have access and you're getting some benefit, which was definitely not the case a few decades ago.
Well, a few decades ago and probably a few months ago, we were talking about the potential of creating education for everybody before, which is also kind of a new perspective, right? That you could potentially have access for quality education for everybody just by using a mobile phone.
So that's precisely the point. And suddenly you can see that websites like Khan Academy, Udacity, and a bunch of other online educational platforms, of course, see a lot of students from usual suspects from Europe, United States, and so on. But I also see a tremendous influx of students from underprivileged environments, which traditionally had zero access to good education, zero access to teachers, zero access to information. And essentially, internet is this great leveler that gives people much more access to such resources. Not only that, I should say, because the other advantage is that in the past, if you wanted to work at one of the large corporations or companies, you probably needed to live somewhere close to their offices, because we worked in person and we needed to attend the team meetings and have access to equipment that was somewhere in the office building. But these days, growing fraction of jobs can be pursued, can be done remotely, which essentially means that a person living somewhere in a small village in India can compete on a job market with nearly the same vigor and the same access to jobs as a person living in the Bay Area, while the person living in the Bay Area is suffering from extremely high living costs, extremely high costs of access to food and accommodation and so on. So one could even say that in some ways now people living in less privileged areas are gaining privilege on the job market, because they can essentially perform the same job at much lower cost and still be better off at the end of the day. Just take me as an example. I think I spent great majority of my life training myself and preparing myself for the job I'm doing at the moment. I also come from the underprivileged environment. I was born in communist Poland, so I'm not complaining, but I wasn't born in New York City, and suddenly I find myself spending more than half of my income to just find accommodation. And for this price, I could probably just rent an island in some other place of the world.
Maybe you should consider that.
Yes, if you know of any nice island, somewhere nice, I should probably consider moving there.
I will be on the lookout for it. What you describe is a kind of a positive utopia that comes with access to something that, we used to think that internet is useful for watching cat videos and that's about it. And now we realize that a lot of stuff that we do in our day-to-day life is dependent on internet, basically, right? And so what you describe with job market being shifted towards an online life is, has its advantages and potential. However, in a context like Mexico, they've calculated recently that it's about 20% of jobs that can be shifted to a home office mode. And for most other jobs, that's not possible. So what does this need to be based on digital technology and at the same time not having the same option to shift to a home office work environment, let's say? What does it do to a supposed digital divide?
Well, you do not need to shift all of the jobs to the digital environment. First of all, let me start with the following statement. 20 years ago, 0% of jobs could be done through the internet. And now we have 20% of jobs, which is a significant fraction. Not to mention that as Mexican economy becomes more focused or more driven by service industry, that probably this fraction will be essentially rapidly increasing. And now I just want to say that those jobs that happen on the internet, suddenly people living far away from big metropolis like Mexico City can compete for the same jobs of people living in Mexico City, which, of course, there are always losers and winners of every change like that, which, of course, is not so good news for people living in Mexico City. But it's amazing news for an average Mexican person who now will have essentially access to much better jobs, not only in Mexico, by the way, but globally, because once you start working remotely for a Mexican company, why wouldn't you consider working remotely for an American or European company? That's also an option. And again, even if not everyone is doing it, even if just few percent of people will now say, well, let me just try to compete on other job markets. This essentially means that remaining people, their salaries will have to go up if job market is to work as supposed. And this also relates to people that have jobs that cannot be easily turned into remote manner. As essentially more and more people stay at home to work from their home offices, few interesting things happen. First of all, there are fewer people available for other jobs. So suddenly their value on the job market goes up, which is good. People can move out to more remote places. Maybe they can go back to the town they're coming from, meaning that the prices of housing will go down, meaning that housing is going to be more affordable and people have much larger living spaces, which again, is very bad for people owning property. If you are a big property owner in Mexico City, you're probably pretty freaked out about the fact that people now started working remotely. But if you're an average person and have access to cheaper accommodation, that's essentially great for you. And there's yet another interesting thought that I have, which is that all of those office buildings that are now filled with people commuting every day in the morning, spending an hour in a traffic jam, polluting the environment, polluting themselves, wasting fuel to get to the office building, and then take some space just to work on a computer, which they could easily do at home, suddenly it means that we'll have less traffic and maybe some of those office buildings will be converted to living spaces, which again will improve the quality of life of everyone.
And maybe with the plants and they'll be green and life will be beautiful.
Here you go.
I like the idea. I mean, there's a caveat maybe on your phrase of if markets work as they're supposed to, which we can probably put in doubt. But in principle, I think there's a very good point you make in highlighting the potential for good and bad that all of these changes can always have, right? And especially in relation to the environmental impact that you mentioned, there's, of course, certain dilemma related to technological change. It reminds me that many, many years ago, you introduced me to the fabulous book Catch-22, the Heller version of what was happening in Second World War to a bomber pilot who cannot declare himself insane because then he cannot work, but also if he doesn't declare himself insane, he will have to work. And I'm thinking about a maybe similar Catch-22 in terms of the technologies that we want to use to clean the environment, while at the same time developing technologies is also possibly harmful for the environment in the process. So it becomes this, how do we get out of this loop?
I think so you mentioned before a utopia, and we are totally living in a utopia from the perspective of a person living 200 years ago. The world that we're occupying now, with population that's great fraction of the population has access to some healthcare. Great fraction and quickly growing fraction of the population, world population, has access to drinking water, electricity, internet, communication channels that are not controlled by the government. It's just essentially, while still we're suffering as humanity from many drawbacks and problems, just our life quality is just incomparably better than the life quality of our grandparents or great-grandparents. And of course, again, there might be people whose lives are worse than the lives of the parents and grandparents. But on average, an average person, and we should always, I'm sorry to say, but when speaking about the future of the world, we should always think about an average person. Average person is just so much better off. Our economies became so much more energy efficient. We have so many more people and we have so many more things and so much more well-being. And yet our environmental impact is actually going down every single year. We're emitting less CO2, we are emitting less poisons and dumping them in the rivers and oceans. So while I think that, of course, this tempo of progress aimed at reducing pollution and so on should increase, I think we're doing a great job compared with what we're doing, 10, 20, 50 years ago.
I'm sure that's an empirical question, and maybe we can discuss or we can disagree about the details of our impact or improvement. But in principle, I wanted to ask you how you see the potential of these technologies for a better future. What do you imagine could be a positive impact that they could have?
Well, it always kind of sounds a bit funny that we kind of constantly think about what the potential of the future those technologies have, while completely being unimpressed by all of those amazing things that those technologies brought us today, today and yesterday and a year ago, right? We carrying supercomputers in our pockets, and even very non-affluent person can now afford to buy a computer that 20, 30 years ago was just available to, military institutions in the government and was definitely not available to just us normal people. We can now communicate across the world instantly, exchanging information that is still, luckily, outside of the full control of the government, which, by the way, again, has disadvantages like terrorism and criminal networks being able to communicate as well. But it also has huge advantages in, let's say, people wishing for more transparency and more democracy, being able to communicate in an uncensored way. We have access to unprecedented amounts of information. As I mentioned before, perhaps the most importantly, we have access to education and jobs all around the world.
Cut videos.
And cut videos are really important. Imagine how many happy hours, cut videos bring to the humanity every single day.
Michal, before we close, can you tell us what motivates you to continue your research?
Well, what motivates me is curiosity, I think, and people quote much more lofty goals. And of course, I care about lofty goals as well myself. But at the end of the day, what drives me to get up from bed in the morning and revisit my living room and work remotely on my research yet again, like in a Groundhog Day movie, is essentially curiosity.
Thank you, Michal, for being with us today on this new episode of Futures Frame TV. Curiosity is a great motivator. Michal was telling us about how it also inspires the good and bad in technologies, how there's always potential, and it depends on how we use it. So hopefully we'll be using it for the good, for an improvement. And thank you very much, Michal, for joining us on this episode.
Thank you, Alicia, for having me. Thank you.